What's up guys, this episode we're going to be talking about building advanced background workers with Sidekick batches. This is really cool because it allows you to take a set of background jobs that are running and then batch them together. So when they're finished, you can call a callback and actually go from serial execution to parallel back to serial. And so normally when you're using background jobs, you're going from Rails, which is running in serial, to parallel, and then you're done. But this is important for complex workflows because a lot of times, like when you're building something like Hatchbox, one of the things that you need to keep in mind as you're doing complex things is, for example, when you're doing stuff in the background like creating and configuring servers, sometimes those need to wait for a block of work to be done. So for example, with a cluster of servers, you might have a load balancer that delegates to a bunch of web servers, and this one we want to add a web server to it. So we would have a load balancer and 2 web servers, and this one's also functioning as our cron and background workers and database server as well. But you can imagine that any setup like this is going to have similar problems. So the problem with this is when you go and do the work on the back end. If you submit this, we're going to know that you added a web server, so we need to create that new server in DigitalOcean, and so we can go and fire off that job to do that. And we're going to know that we need to update the load balancer and reconfigure it with the IP address of this new web server. However, if we're going to add, say, maybe a bunch of these, we couldn't do this very easily, and the reason for that is because we're going to create these 2 web servers on DigitalOcean. They may take a random amount of time to create, and we actually can't configure the load balancer immediately, and we couldn't just say, okay, configure all the machines, create the new machines, because this load balancer has to wait until the new web servers are created and we have IP addresses for them. We can't add their IP addresses if we don't have them and into the load balancer. And so that's our problem. We need to go and create all these servers in a batch and wait until all of them are finished, and then we can go and configure all the machines. That way we have all of the required information to go do the configuration. So that's where Sidekick batches came into play. Now we're going to talk about Sidekick batches. This is a pro feature on Sidekick, so it will cost you money, but it's definitely worth it and comes with some awesome other features that would be required pretty much for any production application using advanced background workers like this. So you also have the ability to use an open source version of Sidekick batches, which adds the same API. I'm going to show you that one just so that you guys can clone this repo and try it out as well, but you probably will want to use Sidekick Pro. So batches are really cool. You basically just write a little configuration like this, and you create a new batch, set a description if you want, but most importantly, you can create a callback. Now, callbacks are probably a little funny looking for you, but the reason for this being in another class where your callbacks are defined is because this is all running in background workers that could run across different machines, and you're not going to have access to wherever this was originally run. So by the time that it's successful and calls the callback, you're not going to have that original, Rails request or model instance anymore. That might be on a whole separate machine. And so this is going to require you to create a new class instance to go and set it up. And then you basically just use this jobs block to create all your new workers, and that's about it. And your jobs will run and that batch, and then we'll instantiate this callback class, whatever you define it as. It'll pass in any extra options that you might want to add, so you can go ahead and have that. But that's kind of it. So let's take a look at an example. We're going to try and use this concept as an example, just so you can wrap your head around it. So what I've got here is a brand new Rails application, and I've added a few gems to it using the Jumpstart template. But namely, we're going to add Sidekick Batch. So you can either use Sidekick Pro or Sidekick Batch. This one's going to allow you guys to clone this repo and check it out. So we're going to use that. Then we just need to create a couple jobs, or a place that will create the batch at least. I've done that in a job itself. So I have a job that creates a batch and runs those. But you could do this inside of your models, your controllers, your plain old Ruby objects, anywhere you want. To create the batch. All of that code is going to obviously be run in Sidekick though. So all of their worker stuff is going to run there. So let's create a job really quick. Let's say edit app jobs, create server job.rb. So our create server job is going to have the perform method, and we need to include Sidekick worker here. And the reason we want to use this instead of from active job is because with Sidekick batches, you want to make sure that you stick to Sidekick itself. You don't want to have any active job stuff interfering with that. And this will just work much, much nicer this way if you're only interacting with Sidekick. So you may need to convert some of your jobs over to pure Sidekick, but it's really easy. The only thing you really need to change is this line here, don't inherit from active job, and say perform async instead of perform later with active job. So that's about it. And in here, you want to do some work. So you want to do your work in parallel. That's about it. You don't need to do anything too fancy here. And wherever you want to trigger these workers is where you want to create the job stuff or the batch stuff. So let's create another job called create cluster job. Class create cluster job, perform, and in here's where we want to create our batch. So we'll say batch equals Sidekick batch.new batch.description equals creating cluster. And then we'll also say batch.on success. We want to call some sort of callback. So you can give it a class name here. You can also, at least with the Sidekick batch, give it a string here and it will constantize that as well. So if we just had a class called created here, class created, we could do that. We would need to namespace it, of course. Create cluster job created. That way we have access to that really easily. We can also do this just as a class. And then you can optionally pass in hash of options. So if you needed the cluster ID to be passed in, you could do that as well. So you could do something like this where you pass in the cluster ID. We don't have a cluster model, so I'm just gonna do 999 there. So we have some example for you to see, and then we'll say batch.jobs do, and in here we need to queue up our other jobs. So for example, we'll just keep this easy. We'll say 5.times, we will have this, we'll take the number there, create server job dot perform async, we'll pass in I there, and that will be that. So this will make sure that those get added, and as you go and do this, it will queue up the jobs and start running them. And then inside your callback class here, you just need to say on success, and optionally you can also do def on complete if you want. There is a nuance or difference between the two. I've always used on success, so that's what we're gonna use here. Both of them take a status and options. So you can print out the status and the options as well. Options should be just this hash exactly as you passed it in, and then status will be the Sidekick status. So let's put a separator here and put created cluster period. So we should see that whenever these server jobs are finished. So this is the work that you're going to want to do in parallel. So let's just sleep for like a random amount of time between 1 and 10 seconds. And then we'll print out creating server ... and we could give it the ID here that we passed in. And then after it's done, created, just so we can see in our logs the exact server lines that are matching each other, so we can count them and make sure that all of that is correct. Because we should only see this print out one time. We should see this stuff print out however many times we call it. So 5 times in this case, 10 times if you change it to 10, whatever. And so we now have this job basically triggering a bunch of other ones, and this code is going to be run whenever it's finished, just a single time. And it will also be running in Sidekick. So that's another thing to keep in mind. That's why this class is instantiated, because it's running on whatever server that will run on inside of Sidekick. So it won't have access to any of the instance variables or other local stuff, because this will be a brand new instance of this created class when it runs. That's why you need to have the ability to pass in these options to access, say, your cluster ID when this is finished, to figure out which cluster you need to mark as active, for example. So with that said, we can go to the Rails console and try this out. Let's start up Sidekick so we have that running, and we'll say create cluster job.new.perform. And if everything went correctly, we should see it queued up 5 jobs. That's the IDs of those jobs, Sidekick, and here we can see them running. And so we've got servers 0 through 4, so 5 of them, and you can see that they're running in whatever order Sidekick processed them first. We can see 3 was finished before some of the other ones, and all of that has completed successfully. So we see it started 5 jobs and it completed 5 jobs. And then at the very end, it started a new Sidekick batch callback worker, which is what the gem implemented for us, triggers that as a job, and then this is run just that single time. So this is cool because now we have the ability to go from a single thing running to multiple, and then back to a single thing. And this is really awesome because it allows us to do this distributed over our Sidekick cluster as well. This is very common to do with threading, where you have just a single machine spin up a bunch of threads, do some parallel work, and then join and wait until all those threads are finished, and then do stuff in serial again. But with Sidekick, we can do this distributed across our Sidekick worker servers. So that is really cool and allows us to do a lot more this way in a lot nicer fashion, because this can now be scaled up across multiple machines, which is fantastic. So Sidekick Pro is where you can get this, or use the gem. Definitely would recommend Sidekick Pro. It's gonna have better support. It's going to probably implement all of this more efficiently or whatever, and it's definitely going to get improved as time goes on. So this feature is definitely kind of a requirement as you get into building more advanced background jobs. You're probably going to need this for certain situations because you have a workflow that you need your code to run, and this is going to help you build those workflows. For example, your created callback could actually start up another batch and trigger another one. So this is pretty interesting. You can have this stuff start chaining batches together, and that's what I do in Hatchbox. So it's pretty neat to see how all of this works and what complex stuff you can do. So this is very cool. And this is, of course, a complex feature that's required for many applications. And so I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you want to see more advanced background workers or Sidekick stuff, let me know in the comments below. Now we'll talk to you guys in the next episode. Peace.